He was one of the biggest pop stars the world has ever seen, a man who sold over 120 million records and achieved a level of success most artists can only dream of. But behind the sold-out stadiums and the iconic music videos, George Michael was living a nightmare. He was a global superstar who hated the spotlight, a musical genius who felt like a prisoner of his own fame. He once said, "I'm a very unhappy man, I'm famous, and that's a shot." He wished he'd been born with a different suit of armor, one that could handle the crushing weight of it all. But he wasn't, and the story of why is far more tragic and complex than the public ever knew. George Michael's story begins not with glamour, but with the smell of fish and chips. Growing up in North London, his family lived above a launderette, and his Greek Cypriot immigrant father, Jack, worked relentlessly at his restaurant. Jack was a stern, practical man who had fled poverty and believed that hard work and financial security were the only things that mattered. He had no time for frivolous dreams, especially not his son's. When a young, shy Georgios Panayiotou announced he wanted to be a pop star, his father's reaction was brutal and dismissive. He flatly told him he couldn't sing and that he had no chance of success. This wasn't just a lack of support, it was a deep-seated disapproval that created a wound George would carry for the rest of his life. He grew up feeling that his true self was a source of disappointment. He was a quiet, insecure boy who wore glasses and was often overweight. His only real escape was music. He would lock himself away for hours, listening to Elton John and Queen, dissecting their songs and dreaming of a different life. The confident, charismatic sex symbol the world would later fall in love with didn't exist yet. He was an invention, a character George would have to create to survive. Everything changed the day a new student walked into his classroom. His name was Andrew Ridgeley, and he was everything George wasn't: cocky, outgoing, and supremely confident. The teacher asked if anyone would look after the new boy, and Andrew, seeing the quiet kid in the corner, chose George. It was a decision that would alter the course of pop music forever. Andrew became the leader, the charming frontman of their friendship. He saw the raw, hidden talent behind George's shyness and became his biggest champion. He gave George the courage to step forward, to take off his glasses, and to believe in his own abilities. Andrew was the key that unlocked George Michael. Together, they formed a ska band called The Executive, before evolving into the pop duo Wham. Their chemistry was undeniable. George was the musical engine, a prodigy writing and producing songs with a sophistication far beyond his years, while Andrew provided the vision, the style, and the swagger that got them noticed. He was the social architect who knew they needed an image to sell their sound. They were a perfect package, ready for stardom, but they were about to learn their first hard lesson about the dark side of the music business. After recording a demo tape on a borrowed 4-track recorder, which included an early version of Careless Whisper, they caught the attention of a small independent label called Invention. The head of the company, Mark Dean, cornered the two teenagers in a Greasy Spoon cafe, holding a contract in his hand. He gave them an ultimatum: sign it right now, or the deal was off, and they wouldn't even get to keep their own demo tapes. With no lawyers and no one to advise them, they felt they had no choice. They signed what would become one of the most exploitative deals in music history. It gave them a tiny advance and an abysmal royalty rate, essentially making them indentured servants to the label. But it got them in the door. Their big break came by pure luck. A band dropped out of the legendary TV show Top of the Pops, and Wham was called in as a last-minute replacement. They performed Young Gun's Go For It, and overnight they exploded. The record shot up the charts, and they became teen idols. But that predatory contract still hung over their heads. Even as global superstars, they were making almost no money. It took a long, bitter legal battle to finally break free from Invention and sign with a major label, Sony. The experience left George with a deep-seated mistrust of the industry, a seed of resentment that would later grow into an all-out war. As Wham conquered the world with their bright, sunny image of shuttlecocks in Choose Life t-shirts, George was hiding a secret that was tearing him apart. He was wrestling with his sexuality. In the early 1980s, in the midst of the AIDS epidemic, being gay was shrouded in fear and prejudice. The tabloid press was ruthless, and public figures lived in terror of being outed. George was convinced that revealing his true self would not only end his career, but also break his mother's heart and confirm his father's worst fears about him being a failure. He confided in his close friend and backup singer Shirley Holliman, who then told Andrew during a trip to Ibiza he had an intense heart-to-heart heart-to-heart conversation with Andrew, who was completely supportive, but George couldn't bring himself to tell his parents. He felt he had no choice but to keep up the facade, playing the part of the straight heartthrob while feeling like a complete imposter. The pressure was immense. He was living a double life, and the joyful, carefree music he was creating was a mask for his inner turmoil. Wham! Eventually ended at its peak with a spectacular final concert at Wembley Stadium. It was the perfect ending for the band, but for George, it was the beginning of a much lonelier and more dangerous journey. Just as his solo career was taking off with the monumental album Faith, George Michael's life changed forever. In 1991, at the Rock in Rio festival, he spotted a man in the crowd. Their eyes met, and George felt an instant magnetic connection. The man's name was Anselmo Filipa, a Brazilian dress designer. For the first time, George was deeply, truly in love. He later described it as an easy, unconditional love from someone who wasn't impressed by his fame. For 6 incredible months, he was happier than he had ever been, but their love story was destined for tragedy. Just months into their relationship, Anselmo developed a persistent flu and decided to get a test. The results were devastating. Anselmo was HIV positive. In an era still gripped by terror, George was paralyzed by fear, not just for Anselmo, but for himself. He endured an agonizing wait for his own test results, which came back negative. He spent the next year and a half in a state of constant dread, waiting for the phone call that would shatter his world. That call came in 1993. Anselmo had succumbed to an AIDS-related brain hemorrhage. George was utterly broken. The profound grief he felt poured into his music, leading him to write one of his most beautiful and haunting songs, Jesus to a Child, a tribute to the man he called the love of his life. Losing Anselmo was a shattering blow, but fate had another cruel twist in store. Just a few years later, his beloved mother, Leslie, who had been his staunchest emotional supporter, was diagnosed with cancer. George spent every moment he could by her side, but in 1997, she too was gone. The double blow of losing the 2 most important people in his life in such a short span sent him into a deep, dark spiral of depression. He felt that God was punishing him for his success and happiness. It was during this period of intense grief that his long-simmering resentment towards the music industry finally boiled over. He took his record label Sony to court, accusing them of professional slavery and demanding to be released from his contract. He argued that the label saw him as nothing more than a product to be sold, with no regard for his artistic integrity or his personal suffering. It was a shocking, career-defining move that no artist of his stature had ever attempted. He lost the case, and many in the industry turned against him. But he didn't care. He was a man drowning in pain, fighting a war against a machine he felt was trying to own his soul. For years, George had carefully controlled his public image, hiding his true self from the world. But in 1998, that control was violently ripped away. He was arrested in a public park in Beverly Hills by an undercover officer in what was clearly a sting operation. The news exploded across the globe, and the secret he had guarded for so long was now tabloid fodder. It was a moment of profound public humiliation, but instead of hiding, George did something remarkable. He went on CNN and faced the scandal head-on. He finally officially came out to the world, not on his own terms, but with a sense of bold defiance. He refused to be ashamed. He even mocked the entire incident in his music video for the song Outside, which featured dancing policemen and disco ball urinals. It was a turning point. The arrest that was meant to shame him became a moment of liberation. He was no longer hiding. For better or worse, the world now knew who he really was. The mask was finally irrevocably off. In his later years, George Michael became increasingly reclusive. The headlines were often filled with stories of his personal struggles, health scares, and run-ins with the law. He seemed like a broken man, a tragic figure who had lost his way after a near-fatal bout of pneumonia in 2011 left him physically and emotionally scarred. The world saw the controversy, but they didn't see what was happening behind the scenes. Because in private, George Michael was living a secret second life. After he passed away on Christmas Day in 2016, stories began to emerge that painted a completely different picture of the man. It was revealed that he had been an incredible and incredibly secret philanthropist. He anonymously donated millions to charities like Childline and Macmillan Cancer Support. He once heard a woman on the game show Deal or No Deal say she needed $15,000 for IVF treatment. He secretly called the station the next day and gave her the money. He worked undercover at a homeless shelter, asking the staff to keep his identity a secret. He once tipped a student nurse $5,000 because she was in debt. He just wanted to help quietly and without recognition. This was the real George Michael, a man with a profoundly kind heart who felt the pain of others because he had known so much of it himself. George Michael's story is a heartbreaking paradox. He was a man blessed with a once-in-a-generation talent who saw his gift as a curse. He wrote songs that became the soundtrack to millions of lives, yet he could never truly enjoy the adoration that came with them. He spent his life building a wall around himself, only to have it torn down in the most public way imaginable. His legacy is not just in the timeless music he left behind, but in the story of a sensitive soul who fought a lifelong battle against the crushing demands of fame. He was the reluctant superstar, the secret philanthropist, and the tragic hero of his own story. A man who just wanted to be loved for who he was, far away from the blinding lights of the stage.